We begin with the biggest challenge in years to the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Thousands of rebel Islamist fighters have taken over much of the second city, Aleppo, also seizing control of the airport and dozens of towns and villages. Syria and its ally Russia have carried out airstrikes against the rebels. Assad has vowed to defeat the insurgents.
Rebel fighters celebrate in the central town square in the heart of Aleppo. They fire off victory shots. Some even get down on their knees and kiss the ground.
The happiness is indescribable, the happiness of liberating the city of Aleppo. We're now in the main square. We've been waiting for this for 10 years. It's an indescribable feeling. My older brother was martyred here in Aleppo 13 years ago. Praise to God. Praise to God.
This video purportedly shows armed gunmen in trucks seizing control of the city's civilian airport. The Syrian army admits it's lost control of much of Aleppo, which it held for 8 years, and dozens of its soldiers were killed when a coalition of rebel groups launched a surprise attack a few days ago. They seized a military base, weapons, and even tanks from Syrian government forces. The lightning offensive is led by the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which used to be al-Qaeda's branch in Syria before severing ties. The coalition consists of multiple groups with differing ideologies. What unites them is their opposition to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This assault is the biggest challenge in years to his regime and has jolted the front lines of the Syrian civil war that have largely remained frozen since 2020. The rebels have also taken control of dozens of strategic towns in Hama and Idlib provinces. Russia launched a series of overnight strikes across the city in a bid to stop the rebels. It was the first time in 8 years Russian warplanes hit Aleppo.
All right, let's bring in Aaron Zelin, a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a founder of Jihadology.net. Good to have you with us. Wondering what Syria's President Bashar al-Assad has said that the government will do everything to beat the terrorists. Do you believe at this point the Syrian army is indeed strong enough to repel rebel forces?
I think in the areas that it's the core territories where you have minority groups like the Alawites, which is what the regime is from, as well as others like the Ismailis and Shia, even working with Christians in sort of the coastal areas of Syria, as well as around Damascus. It'll be useful, but in terms of those outerlying areas that we've seen them quickly take from the regime, it's going to be very difficult. It's important to remember that the areas that the regime took from the insurgency back in 2015 to 2020 was mainly done by Russian air power as well as Iranian proxy networks on the ground.
Right, so what do we know, Aaron, about the militants, HTS, and what do we know specifically about their foreign backing?
I mean, for the most part, they primarily rely upon their own governance locally within northwest Syria via taxation as well as commerce. Of course, there's cross-border trade with Turkey because it's on the Turkish border. But unlike, other rebel groups in Syria, such as the Syrian National Army, which is backed by Turkey, HTS has been mainly independent.
And the group, for their part, still seems to be gaining ground, taking ground. We've seen even some reports about clashes in the capital, Damascus. Can the rebels realistically gain control over major areas in the country?
Well, we've already seen them take Aleppo as well as Hama City, which is unprecedented. We didn't even take this when the rebels took a lot of areas a decade ago. So what we're seeing has never happened before in the history of the Syrian conflict over the last 14 years. However, now they're starting to get into sort of the core territories of where the regime's stronghold is on the coastal regions in Latakia, Tartus, parts of Homs and Hama, as well as Damascus. And that will be a bit tougher because that's where a lot of the security forces and intelligence agencies are, in a way that maybe there weren't in other areas in northern Syria, which was primarily being propped up by Iranian proxy militia.
And what options do Assad's backers, you mentioned Russia earlier, Russia and Iran have right now?
They're definitely in a more difficult position now compared to when Russia first entered the conflict a decade ago, as well as Iran, because of Russia's involvement in the war in Ukraine, as well as recently Iran's backing of both Hamas and Hezbollah in the war that Israel's been conducting against them. And therefore, both of them have been weakened on some level or have other priorities right now. And that's one of the ways that HTS, as well as this hodgepodge of other groups, have been able to take advantage. I imagine that over the next week or so that, there will be a ton of meetings between the Russians, the regime, the Iranians, different Shia militia from Iraq, from Lebanon, possibly even bringing in the Houthis now because of how successful they've seemed in their campaign in Yemen over the last year or so, and how that they might be able to push back. The question is if they have enough manpower as well as military capabilities as they did a decade ago, just because the context has changed so much in the past decade now, especially in the last 4 years.
Yeah, the Syrian conflict had subsided for some years with the Islamist rebels largely confined to one area around Idlib. Now this flare-up. Can this, you think, lead to a full-blown conflict again?
I think some of the places to look for in the future is in the south in Dara region, which is just south of Damascus. That's the cradle of the revolution where the first protests happened in 2011. If they're able to get things going again, the province next door in Sweda has been actively protesting against the regime, which is predominantly Druze for the last year or so. So there's definitely a lot of points where the regime is weak and not able to control different parts of the country beyond just what we're seeing in the north.
And one more before we go, the US involvement or potential involvement here, how do you see that unfolding?
It's been quite surprising that the U.S. government actually hasn't said one thing about what's been going on yet, and it's been 4 days now. Obviously, it's Thanksgiving in the United States, but still, this is a monumental event in Syria. I suspect that for the most part, it'll stay out of it. There might be some diplomatic, meetings and trying to work out things, but the reality is a lot of the players on the ground that are forcing these events and what's going on there really doesn't have to do with the United States, at least for now, unless it gets into eastern Syria where the U.S. presence is in its fight against the Islamic State.
Aaron Zelin, many thanks for your time.
Thank you.